modern M1A2 Abrams, 69.5 metric tons, sitting in army depots right now, would destroy the Baneblade with a single shot to the front. Not a lucky hit, not a flank shot on a damaged vehicle, a clean frontal engagement at standard combat distance. One round. No Warhammer 40,000 tank ranking will ever open with that sentence. They open with the lore. The Imperium's greatest super heavy, the apex of armored doctrine, the machine that breaks siege lines and wins wars before lunch. Every ranking leads with the mythology, and the mythology is earned. The Baneblade looks extraordinary, reads as formidable, and has occupied a specific place in 40k player psychology for decades. The problem isn't the lore. The problem is the numbers. This isn't a ranking. This is a trial. Games Workshop chose to publish fictional vehicle statistics in real-world units. Millimeters for caliber, metric tons for weight, kilometers for range. They didn't have to.
The option existed to use fictional measurements, invented notation, anything that would keep the specifications inside the setting's own logic. Instead, they opened their codexes to the same measurement system a military engineer uses, attached figures to fictional weapons, and published them. That choice isn't neutral. It's an invitation to check the arithmetic. And when you check the arithmetic, the Imperium's finest super heavy dies to a vehicle that fits on a car transporter. The core charge is false specificity. The prosecution has the numbers. The community's accepted weight for the Baneblade is 316 metric tons. That figure circulates on fan wikis, Lexicanum, the Warhammer 40k fandom wiki, and the evidence trail stops before it reaches a specific Games Workshop Codex page. No edition number, no page reference, no primary publication to anchor it. So every time this weight appears in the prosecution, it carries that caveat. These are the community's own accepted numbers. The community built their mythology on 316 tons. The community's own numbers are what convict it. 316 metric tons. To understand what that means in physical reality, one historical reference is all you need. The Panzer VIII Maus. Germany built it in 1944 and 1945. It's officially the heaviest tank ever fully constructed, and it weighed 188 metric tons. Not 316. Not within shouting distance of 316. The most extreme, super heavy tank project ever pursued by any military power in recorded history came in at 188 tons, and it was abandoned. Not purely because the war ended, though the war's end helped, but because physics filed the rejection letter first. Off-road top speed, 13 kilometers per hour. Bridge crossings were effectively impossible. The ground pressure of a 188-ton vehicle eliminated most European infrastructure as viable transit terrain. The engine-to-weight ratio produced a machine that moved slower than a jogging soldier on anything softer than hardpan. Wikipedia's Panzer VIII Maus article describes it directly. The top speed of 13 kilometers per hour off-road, along with a total weight of almost 190 tons, which made crossing bridges practically impossible, posed significant disadvantages. Germany had some of the most accomplished tank engineers in the world in 1944. They built the thing and watched it fail. 2 incomplete prototypes, no combat deployments. The Baneblade, at the community's accepted 316 metric tons, is 1.68 times heavier than the vehicle physics itself destroyed. Every engineering problem that killed the Maus, the ground pressure, the bridge weight limits, the engine-to-weight ratio, the catastrophic off-road mobility, scales geometrically worse at 316 tons. The fandom wiki gives the Baneblade a listed top speed of 25 kilometers per hour at 316 tons. The Maus managed 13 kilometers per hour off-road at 188 before the project was put down. At 316 tons, 25 kilometers per hour isn't a specification, it's a wish. The weight alone is the prosecution's opening statement. The engagement range is the verdict. The community's accepted effective range for the Baneblade's main cannon is 1 kilometer. Same caveat. That figure hasn't been confirmed in any specific codex. It's the community's number, and it's the number that hands the M1A2 the kill. During the Gulf War in 1991, M1A1 Abrams crews recorded confirmed tank kills at ranges in excess of 2,500 meters. Not estimated, confirmed. The documented language is precise. Could kill other tanks at ranges in excess of 8,200 feet, that's 2,500 meters, in actual combat against moving targets. Well beyond 2 kilometers isn't a manufacturer's marketing line. It's the combat record. The Abrams' primary anti-armor round is the M829A3 APF SDS, armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot. The actual U.S. military penetration specifications are classified. That isn't rhetorical hedging. The figures genuinely sit behind a classification stamp. What open-source analysts and defense publications work from is an estimated penetration. Above 750 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at 2,000 meters, with 765 millimeters being the specific figure in common circulation. Tanks Encyclopedia is among the sources citing that estimate. Estimated, not confirmed. But 765 millimeters at 2 kilometers is what every open-source ballistics analysis uses when calculating what the M829A3 can defeat. Now build the engagement. The Abrams crew locates the Baneblade at 2,000 meters, a standard combat distance backed by documented Gulf War performance. The Baneblade's community-accepted range is 1 kilometer. At 2,000 meters, the main cannon can't reach the Abrams. The Baneblade crew has no return shot. The M829A3 leaves the barrel at a velocity that provides the crew with no meaningful warning, travels 2,000 meters, and delivers an estimated 765 millimeters of penetration against whatever armor sits at the front of that hull. The Baneblade doesn't get a move. It dies at a range its own specifications say is outside its engagement envelope. Then the prosecution turns around, because this works in both directions. The M1A2 SEP's turret front armor is estimated at 940 to 960 millimeters kinetic equivalent against APF SDS rounds. Again, open source estimate. The actual figures are classified. If the Baneblade's cannon delivers less than 940 millimeters of kinetic penetration at range, and nothing in the available lore defines a number that would survive the comparison, the Abrams doesn't just kill the Baneblade. The Abrams absorbs the hit and the crew drives home. One vehicle in this matchup exists and has a confirmed combat record. The other one's weight is disputed even within the fan community that invented it. There is a defense that gets raised at this point, and it deserves exactly 2 fair sentences. Making the numbers match the lore would make the game impossible to balance. You can't write rules around a vehicle that outranges everything by a factor of 2 and weighs 1.68 mouse. That's a legitimate design constraint, and it's true. The crime was never unbalanced mechanics. The crime was choosing real-world units and then not doing the math. If GW had published Effective Range Extreme or invented a fictional measurement system, there'd be nothing to prosecute. The moment they wrote 1 kilometer and 316 metric tons in the same document system used to measure real tanks, they opened the Baneblade to real scrutiny. They made that choice. Before moving to the next exhibit, a physics correction worth making, one that signals this prosecution has done its homework. A comment that accumulated 16 engagements claimed that APF-SDS sabot rounds liquefy on impact. The intuition is understandable. Something extreme is happening when a dense metal rod moving at that velocity meets steel plate. But liquefy is the wrong term, and getting this right matters in front of an audience that will fact-check it. The mechanism is called hydrodynamic penetration through adiabatic shearing. At the impact velocities these rounds achieve, the stress applied to both the penetrator rod and the target armor exceeds their dynamic yield strength so rapidly that both materials deform plastically. They flow under the pressure rather than fracturing conventionally. Wikipedia's APFSDS entry states it precisely. At sufficiently high impact velocity, even crystalline materials begin to behave in a highly plastic, fluid-like manner. The key phrase is behave like. There is no phase change. Nothing melts. The word liquefy implies heat-driven phase transition. What's actually occurring is pressure-driven plastic deformation at extraordinary strain rates. Depleted uranium penetrators add a further wrinkle. A steel penetrator tends to mushroom at the tip during this process, widening the head and reducing the driving pressure. DU rods fracture differently. The tip breaks away in a pattern that maintains a sharp profile. The penetrator self-sharpens as it penetrates, sustaining the localized pressure that drives it through the plate. That self-sharpening property is one reason depleted uranium penetrators outperform equivalent steel rods. The physics is specific and documented. Liquefy sounds right. It isn't. The prosecution now suspends for the most important ruling in the entire proceeding. At some point in the history of Warhammer 40,000, the community cites it widely enough that any veteran player knows exactly what's coming. There existed a rule for orc transport vehicles where models that physically toppled off your stacked battle wagon during play were counted as casualties. Not casualties from shooting, not casualties from failed armor saves. Casualties from gravity. From your hand trembling slightly when you moved the vehicle across the table. From the mild unevenness of a folding table at 11 o'clock on a tournament Friday. From someone at the adjacent table slamming down a dice tray with enthusiasm. Games Workshop published a rule where the random element wasn't the dice. It was the structural integrity of your model pile and the ambient vibration of the room. An orc warboss could survive a direct hit from a battle cannon in the rules as written, then get declared a casualty because a beverage was set down too hard nearby. That single rule scored approximately 10 times the engagement of the next highest item in the entire discussion dataset surrounding this topic. 10 times. The orc players always understood something the Imperium's armor designers never did. The most dangerous terrain feature in any engagement is the table edge. Exhibit 2. The Lehman Russ Battle Cannon. The figure most commonly cited in the community for the battle cannon's caliber is 120 millimeters. That number hasn't been confirmed from a primary Games Workshop codex with a specific page citation. The source record simply doesn't produce one. But 120 millimeters is what circulates, and 120 millimeters is what the model refuses to support when examined against a real reference. A clean, real-world comparison exists. The M256 smoothbore on the M1A2 Abrams is 120 millimeters. You can see what that barrel looks like proportionally on a vehicle of known dimensions. Hold that visual reference against the Lehman Russ battle cannon, and the proportions don't align. Community members examining the model have placed the visual caliber at a minimum of 200 millimeters based on the barrel diameter relative to the hull scale. A separate community observation notes the Lehman Russ turret appears too small to internally house the breech mechanism that a barrel of that apparent diameter would require, which cuts a different direction, pointing at internal inconsistency rather than simple mislabeling. Either the caliber is wrong or the model is wrong. Both options land on Games Workshop's tab, and both involve real-world millimeters that were attached to the specification. Exhibit 3 requires a single historical fact. The British Mark I heavy tank, introduced in 1916, mounted 6-pounder guns in hull sponsons as its primary offensive armament. The Mark IV and Mark V followed the same configuration through the war. By 1918, every military power developing armor had recognized that sponson primary design was inferior in every tactical dimension. Limited firing arc, restricted traverse, crew exposure to counterfire, structural weakness at the mounting points. Rotating turrets offered 360-degree engagement capability and solved every one of those problems. Sponson primary armament on tanks was a dead design philosophy by the time the armistice was signed. The Land Raider places its twin las cannons in sponsons as the primary armament. In the 41st millennium, the Adeptus Mechanicus, custodians of humanity's most sacred military technologies, the priests of the machine god, architects of the greatest armored vehicles in human history, preserved a weapons placement approach that real military engineers abandoned 107 years before this sentence was written. The comment that surfaces in every Land Raider discussion is accurate. Someone needs to apologize for the design of the Land Raider. The apology is owed to the rotating turret. The firing arc restrictions and structural compromises that ended sponson primary design in 1918 didn't stop being physics because the calendar reached M41. 3 additional exhibits, moving quickly. The Eldar Night Spinner's Doomweaver fires monofilament wire fine enough in lore to cut through biological tissue and armor on contact. The real-world problem is aerodynamic. Monofilament wire fired as a projectile faces stability issues across any meaningful range, tensile management problems, and a fundamental difficulty maintaining the geometric relationship to a target that would make cuts on contact a coherent mechanism at battlefield distances. 66 engagement points of audience interest surrounded that vehicle. The competitor's video didn't mention it once. The Basilisk's Earthshaker cannon is cited across community discussions for extreme range performance. A grounding comparison. The M109 Paladin self-propelled howitzer achieves 30 kilometers standard, up to 40 with rocket-assisted projectiles. The community-cited range figures for the Earthshaker have never been anchored to a codex page that anyone in these discussions has been able to produce on demand. The Basilisk earns its place on a gaming table through rules design. Its range claims haven't earned a physics defense. The Dark Eldar Raider is an open-topped anti-gravity skimmer carrying troops into assault at combat speeds with no overhead protection, an unexplained anti-gravity mechanism, and structural integrity assumptions that the lore doesn't attempt to justify in any physical framework. 17 engagement points on that observation, and the competitor left every one of them untouched. One nomenclature correction before the closing argument. The armor material of the Adeptus Custodes is auramite, not adamantium. Adamantium is distributed throughout 40k lore across dozens of factions and applications, appearing on Space Marine armor, vehicle hulls, and fortification components across the entire setting. Auramite is different, Emperor-specific, used exclusively for the Custodian Guard. The distinction is significant to anyone who follows the setting closely, and the audience for this video filed 13 documented factual corrections against the competitor's content. They know the difference. Auramite. Write it down, say it correctly, and give them one fewer reason to type it in the comments. Games Workshop had a choice, and that choice is the closing argument. Fictional vehicles don't require real-world units. The setting could operate on Mechanicus notation, warp measures, abstracted game statistics, anything that keeps the specifications inside the fiction and outside the reach of a ballistics calculator. The decision to use millimeters, metric tons, and kilometers was deliberate. It signals that the numbers were thought through. It implies the figures were checked against something. And it invites every person who understands those units to run the comparison themselves. The comparison returns the same verdict every time. The community's accepted 316 tons is 1.68 times the weight of the heaviest tank physics allowed to exist, and physics destroyed that one in 1945. The community's accepted 1 kilometer effective range sits a full 1,000 meters short of the distance where the M1A2 Abrams recorded confirmed combat kills in 1991. The estimated M829A3
765 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor penetration at 2,000 meters per open-source defense analysis, arrives before the Baneblade crew can respond. And the M1A2's turret front protection, estimated at 940 to 960 millimeters kinetic equivalent, means the Abrams may absorb the Baneblade's return fire and keep fighting. Nothing in the available lore establishes a penetration figure for the Baneblade's cannon that would survive that comparison. The Baneblade isn't guilty of being fictional. Fiction is allowed to be extraordinary. That's what fiction is for. The Baneblade is guilty of pretending to be measurable, of existing in a document system that uses real-world units with community-accepted numbers attached to its hull, numbers that collapse under scrutiny a junior military analyst could produce before their coffee goes cold. You'll still push those models across a table. The hobby doesn't need the physics to hold, and nothing in this prosecution changes what those models feel like in your hands, or what it means when the battle cannon clears an objective at the right moment. But the numbers are in print. They're in real-world units, and every time someone runs them through a calculator, the Imperium's finest super heavy dies to a tank you can load onto a commercial vehicle transporter with room left over. Subscribe. There are more vehicles, more exhibits, and more community numbers that don't survive the arithmetic.